So related to this, there could be certain potential biases. What about data collection? So some hospitals nowadays have informational systems, and others collect data by hand. And different observers, when you enter the data, may obtain different results, so you have to be very, very careful with quality assurance and checking the data. SAPS-3 and ELDICA studies developed scores, and different collection systems could lead to different incidents of missing data or errors in the data that was shown. So here's data from the ETHICA study, just looking at documentation, looking at northern, central, and southern countries, and you see that you have a whole lot more documentation in northern European countries than southern European countries. This relates to end-of-life decisions, but there are other documentation problems in doing a study where that could also lead to certain biases. What about costs? What about costs for doing research in different countries? U.S. Typically has more money for research, but the research is expensive there. And this is information I got from John Kellum at the University of Pittsburgh. He told me in the U.S. nothing in research is for free. Everything is charged to the study. I think this may be a bit of an extreme, but it's interesting. He said no one, no doctor, nurse, technician, or clerk can do anything for a research study that is not paid for by the study. In the U.S., there are special hospital committees that look over your shoulder to make sure that everything's being paid for and not from another fund, so that if you're doing research, they want the salaries, the equipment, whatever, to be paid for. And in fact, in one study John was involved in this renal support study, the grant had to pay for the additional dialysis in the intensive treatment arm and even for the increased fluid use that was used in that trial. So I don't know if that happens in Europe or South America so much. I believe in Europe there's still a sense of academic responsibility to perform research. Many studies are performed without adequate support, certainly not taking money for the research being done. Only recently has the European Commission decided to allow investigators to receive salary support for research. It was typically provided for in institutional overhead costs, and some of the institutions chose to give the investigators the money. My personal institution said, no, that has nothing to do with you doing the research. That's the overhead costs that we're going to take. And in terms of costs, it's important to realize that some societies, the European Society, has funded the Eurotherm project, which is a hypothermia therapy for brain injury, which I guess I'm advertising now for the European Society. What about comparisons? So important variables such as countries or regions may be confounding factors, and they could distort the relationship of the studied variables of interest being related to the outcome under analysis. So that individual-based characteristics, perhaps the country could itself be a surrogate marker for differences between patients related to differences in those countries, perhaps related to chronic disorders, the case mix, or nutrition. And there may be other biases related to variables that may be a surrogate marker of other characteristics, perhaps cultural characteristics on a collective basis. And there may be sampling biases related to collecting the ICUs, the way I sort of mentioned the way we pick our ICUs. So just looking at the ETHICA data, we had much more withdrawing in the northern part of Europe, as was mentioned before, than the southern part of Europe. And this was the geographic areas. We try to tease out the differences between religion, because it turns out there were certain religions who had more withdrawing or withholding, but because of where the religions were, there were more Catholics, obviously in Italy and in the southern countries. We could not tease out the differences between the geographic and cultural areas and religion. And in making these comparisons, we typically use something that's easy, that should be more objective, something like mortality. And we rank ICUs by the observed mortalities after controlling for severity of illness. And obviously the ICU mortality is intimately dependent on the case mix of the various patients. But although illness severity is probably one of the best relevant elements related to the case mix, it's not the complete story. So if you look at some of the ICU categories that were found in the EURECA study to be significant. We obviously a lot of times see severity scores and age and where the patient came from and the type of admission, but there are certain organizational issues that are important in terms of the operating level of care, the admissions per bed per year, the length of stay of the patients, the NEM score, and mortality. Now, what about costs? If you try to do studies related to costs in different countries, that's extremely difficult. In the ELDICA study, as a subpart of the study, we looked at the cost effectiveness of the ICU in 11 different countries. But how do you compare the costs in these different countries? So exchange rates were designed to compare costs in financial markets, which, unlike health service costs, change rapidly. So costs in nations' individual currencies can be deflated to a common form, typically using the World Health Organization purchasing power parities method. And using this method, you deflate each currency to an international dollar, which are a hypothetical currency which reflect purchasing power for each different currency based on the US dollar. In terms of other problems with comparison, studies of critically ill patients for many countries provide important information related to the overall incidence of various diseases, but most of these studies do not take into account the critical care resources used in those countries, and that could change a lot of the factors we're measuring. So the existence of other factors may also be important in terms of what's going on besides the severity. And let me finally end with a research culture. If a patient comes to see an oncologist and the oncologist makes a new diagnosis of cancer, the patient will likely hear about his eligibility for a research protocol before leaving the office. This is not necessarily in an academic institution. This is in a private practice situation also. And I think there's a certain research culture in oncology which we have to look for in terms of critical care also. So I think we have to think of the ICU as a research laboratory. I think we can. I try to provide for you methods where we can make comparisons, some of the problems making those comparisons. But I think probably the most important thing for us as intensivists is to understand the subjects so we can be better physicians.